Hey everyone, and welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into a period that I think is super interesting, the Industrial Revolution.
Oh, absolutely.
And we've got some excerpts from Wikipedia's Industrial Revolution page as our guide.
Great source.
It's going to be an amazing journey. We're talking big inventions, huge changes in society, and I think this is going to be a really good one.
Yeah, and what I think is really cool about the Industrial Revolution is that it wasn't just like one single discovery.
Right.
It was like this chain reaction, kind of like a domino effect where one invention led to another and then another and another, and it just built and built and built on itself.
I like that. Okay, so let's jump into some specifics, starting with textiles. The Wikipedia page mentions, get this, like a 500-fold increase in worker output with mechanized cotton spinning.
That's insane.
It's what?
It's mind-boggling. And that's not even all of it either.
Yeah.
The power loom, that thing boosted productivity over 40 times. So if you think about it, imagine going from making one shirt, maybe in like a week, right, by hand, to making dozens of them in a day.
Yeah.
Like, that's a huge change.
It's unbelievable, right? It's like we're talking science fiction here. The flying shuttle, the spinning jenny, the water frame, the spinning mule. It's like, did they just make these names up?
It sounds very, very futuristic.
But the thing is, the results, they were real.
Oh, yeah.
And huge. I mean, they had big impacts, but not all of them were good. These things made textiles more affordable, sure, but they also created this bigger demand for raw cotton. And that demand, sadly, was met through the expansion of slavery.
Yeah, that's a good point because it shows, I think, how sometimes progress, right, technological advancements can lead to unintended and negative consequences as well.
Well, that's kind of like a cautionary tale, right? Like, it makes you think about, like, the things we're inventing today, and are we doing the same thing, repeating history, even though it's in a different way?
Absolutely. It's a very important question to ask ourselves.
Yeah.
Because, the pace of technological change today is incredible, right? It's so fast. And so I think it's crucial to think about things like labor practices, resource exploitation, and are we creating these inequalities both on a local and global scale as a result of that?
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. So let's shift gears a little bit to another powerful duo that came out of this era.
Okay.
Iron and steam power. I found it really interesting how the sources we've got really highlight how connected those two things were.
Oh, they were totally intertwined.
Yeah, how
like they
clever.
were two sides of the same coin.
Okay.
So you had the switch, right, from using charcoal to coke in iron production. And that was huge.
Right.
It brought costs down, and it meant that, we could build bigger, better furnaces. But these furnaces, they needed a ton of power, which was supplied by steam engines.
Oh, I see. So the steam engines were they were the power behind it all.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's pretty crazy when you think about it. Like these materials like iron and coke-fueled iron, they're still so important today, right? Right. Look around. You see them in buildings, bridges, all of our infrastructure. Like the legacy of the Industrial Revolution is all around us.
That's true. We don't think about that, but it's true.
We take it for granted, yeah.
Yeah.
And while we're on that topic, we also have to talk about the steam engine itself, right?
Yeah.
Because it also went through huge advancements during this time. It became more efficient, more powerful with each iteration.
Like what?
So think about the high-pressure steam engine.
Okay.
Like that was a game changer for transportation. That's what paved the way for things like steamships and locomotives.
So there was a lot of kind of concurrent innovation. It wasn't just that somebody invented this steam engine. It was that they kept improving it and improving it and improving it.
Right, building on those initial ideas.
Yeah. Okay. So speaking of inventions, the article also mentions this thing called machine tools.
Oh, yeah.
They talk about cylinder boring machines and slide rest lathes. And I got to be honest, I'm not sure exactly what those things are or why they were so important.
Oh, so basically machine tools, they were all about precision.
Okay.
Before them, metal parts were mostly made by hand. So that was slow, expensive, and you didn't always get the same result.
Right.
But with machine tools, you could make parts that were identical.
Oh, interesting.
And that's what allowed for mass production and interchangeable parts.
Right.
Like those ideas are still crucial for making everything, cars, computers, you name it.
So it wasn't just about like the iron or the steel, it was about how you worked with it.
Exactly.
And these new tools, they changed the game. Like they made it possible to do things that were never possible before.
Yeah, the precision, the accuracy was a game changer.
Yeah. But we've got to talk about this too. Like the Industrial Revolution wasn't all, fancy machines and booming factories.
Right.
The sources also paint this darker picture, harsh working conditions, child labor, and all these overcrowded slums in the fast-growing cities.
Yeah, that's the flip side of the coin, right?
Yeah.
The middle class was emerging and consumer goods became more available. That's true. But but there was definitely a dark side to all this progress. Factory work was brutal, often dangerous. And, with so many people flooding into these cities, it created these really terrible living conditions for a lot of people.
It's kind of hard to imagine what aspects of life do you think changed the most dramatically back then? Like, can you imagine
Mhm.
going from like a world of farms and handmade stuff to factories and like mass production?
Oh, it would have been mind-blowing. I
Yeah.
mean, that shift, going from a rural life to an urban life, that had such a huge impact on families, communities, on the pace of life itself.
It must have been pretty intense.
It was a complete societal transformation.
Right. And it wasn't just in Great Britain, right? Like, did other parts of the world go through similar changes?
Oh, absolutely. The
Yeah.
Industrial Revolution, it was a global thing,
Okay.
but it played out differently in different places,
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, like countries in continental Europe, like Belgium, France, they kind of followed a similar path to Britain. But the U.S. and Japan, they developed their own unique ways of industrializing.
So it was like this global wave of change reshaping everything.
It really was. And it transformed the world in a way that we still feel today.
Yeah. And one of the big things was it totally changed like where stuff's made.
Absolutely. Before the Industrial Revolution, places like India and China, they were like the centers of textile production.
Right.
But with these new machines in Britain, all that changed.
Right, because now they could do it faster and cheaper.
Exactly. Britain and then other industrializing nations, they kind of took over. And sadly, that contributed to the decline of those traditional manufacturing centers.
So it was more than just like new inventions. It totally changed the balance of power in the world.
It did. And that shift had huge implications for things like colonialism, trade, international relations, the whole 9 yards.
It's amazing how everything is so interconnected.
It really is.
And we can't talk about this without talking about the environment, right?
Right.
Our sources mention things like air and water pollution, deforestation, all that.
Yeah, and that was all a consequence of this rapid growth.
Yeah.
Right? And our reliance on fossil fuels, especially coal. Those environmental problems, they were like a hidden cost of all this progress. And we're still dealing with them today.
It makes you think, right?
Yeah.
Like progress is important, but it always comes with a price, right? And we need to figure out how to balance the economy with keeping the environment healthy.
It's a challenge that we have to face head on. I mean, maybe even more so now than ever before.
Okay, so we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive. We've talked about, the cool new inventions, the hard parts, the good stuff, the bad stuff, and it's super clear that this period of time, it had this big, long-lasting impact on the world. I
Absolutely.
mean, it shapes everything from how we make things to our economies to how we interact with the environment.
It was a period of just unbelievable change. I mean, the scale of transformation was unlike anything that had happened before, and it's still influencing us today.
It really is amazing. We're just scratching the surface here.
Oh, yeah.
There's so much more to uncover about this era, and we're going to do that right after a quick break.
Oh,
So stay tuned. We'll be back with more on the Industrial Revolution in just a minute.
sounds good.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We're continuing our look at the Industrial Revolution. And, before the break, we were talking about the global effects and those environmental issues, but there's just so much more to the story.
Yeah, the Industrial Revolution, it just touched everything. And one of the things that I think is so interesting is how it changed everyday life.
Okay.
Like the sources mention things like gaslighting. And that completely changed the way people spent their evenings.
Oh, I bet.
Like,
Yeah.
all of a sudden you could stay up later, stores could be open longer, and cities just weren't as dark and dangerous at night anymore.
I mean, that must have felt like just a whole new world.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like night and day, literally.
Literally night and day, yeah. And not only that, it also created this whole new, like, nightlife culture. Theaters and cafes and all sorts of entertainment venues, they popped up everywhere because cities were lit up.
It's funny how something as simple as, like, lighting can have such a big impact,
It's a
right?
huge ripple effect, yeah.
Yeah. And speaking of ripple effects, the sources also talk about, like, consumer goods and this
Mhm.
new middle class that could afford them. So, I mean, was it just the factory owners that were benefiting?
No, no, not at all.
Uh, The Industrial Revolution created all these opportunities for entrepreneurs and skilled workers.
Oh, okay.
Shopkeepers, clerks, engineers, even inventors.
Like, it was a time when the economy was really changing.
It was, yeah, super dynamic. New industries and professions were popping up all over the place.
And I guess with more money to spend, people could buy things they never could before.
Right, exactly. Like, mass-produced clothing, furniture, books, you name it. It's like that was the start of modern consumer culture, I guess.
And the department stores and the advertising and all that.
Oh, yeah, it fueled all of that.
Wow. It's crazy to think about.
Yeah.
But, it wasn't all good, right? I mean, we talked about the bad working conditions, those slums. What other, like, social challenges came up during this time?
It's interesting. The sources talk about literacy rates and the role of women. And it's like, it's kind of complicated, the impact the Industrial Revolution had on those things.
Oh, okay. In what way?
So, for one thing, literacy rates actually increased. Really?
Yeah. And that's partly because, like, they needed more skilled workers who could, read and follow instructions.
Right?
Factories were getting more complex, so workers need to understand, like, manuals, diagrams, all that stuff,
Yeah, if you're operating a machine, you gotta know what you're doing.
for sure. And
No.
and the other thing was, like, the paper machine was invented, right?
Hmm.
And steam power was being used for printing, so books and newspapers became cheaper and more accessible.
I guess that definitely helps with literacy.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And it had a big impact on society, too.
How
I
so?
mean, a more educated public, they were more aware of social issues,
Mhm.
and that kind of laid the groundwork for these reform movements that came later.
So in a way, the Industrial Revolution kind of led to more social progress.
It was a catalyst, yeah.
That's interesting. So what about women? Like, how did their lives change?
Well, that's a tough question, to be honest.
Yeah.
Like, historians still debate this. Some say that the Industrial Revolution kind of hurt women's status.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It shifted them from those, like, productive roles they had in agriculture and home industries
Mm.
to low-paid factory work or unpaid work at home.
So they were basically like pushed into less desirable roles.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
But others argue that, even though it was tough for women, it also, like, set the stage for women's rights.
How's that?
Well, for one thing, it brought women together in factories.
Okay.
So they started to have this shared experience and a sense of solidarity.
Yeah.
And as they gained, a little bit more economic independence, they started demanding more rights.
So like more of a voice.
Exactly.
So it's like it was bad, but it also led to something good.
Yeah, it was this double-edged sword.
Yeah.
New challenges, but also new opportunities.
Yeah.
And I think it shows how history is never simple.
Right. It's always more complicated than that.
It is, yeah.
So we've talked about some of the good things that came out of the Industrial Revolution,
Right.
but got to be real, there were some dark sides too.
Yep.
And the sources mention things like child labor and the Luddite movement.
Yeah, so let's talk about child labor first.
Right.
It was a really heartbreaking reality of this period. Like,
Yeah.
kids, some as young as 8 years old, they were forced to work in factories and mines. Long hours, often in really dangerous and unhealthy conditions.
Like, I can't even imagine. Like, why were children even working in the first place?
Well, it was a few things. I mean, kids were cheap labor, and their size made them useful for certain jobs, like, fitting into small spaces in mines or operating some of those intricate machines.
it's hard to think about, but did people like see that it was wrong? Does anybody try to stop it?
Yeah, there was definitely some pushback, especially from the upper and middle classes.
Okay.
And eventually that led to laws like the Factory Acts in Britain, which tried to regulate child labor.
So at least they were trying to protect the kids,
Right.
right?
Yeah, but it was a slow process. And child labor, it continued throughout the 19th century and even into the early 20th century in some places. It's kind of a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line.
Right. Sometimes it takes a while. So what about the Luddites? I mean, I know they didn't like the new machines, but why?
Well, the Luddites were skilled craftsmen, often weavers, and they saw their jobs being threatened by these new machines.
Okay, I get that.
And they felt like the machines were taking their jobs and destroying their way of life.
So they were kind of like fighting back against progress?
Yeah, I guess you could say that. They would target factories and machinery, like destroying them in protest. And yeah, it was often violent, but you got to understand, they were desperate. They were trying to hold on to their traditional skills and way of life.
It's a reminder that technology, it can do a lot of good, but it can also leave some people behind.
Absolutely. And
Mm.
we have to remember that the people who lose out, they often struggle. And I think the Luddite movement, even though it wasn't successful in the end, it shows that there's a human cost of progress. And we have to figure out how to manage those changes
Mhm.
so that everyone benefits, or at least, minimize the harm to certain groups.
Right. Okay, so we've gone over a lot here, the good and the bad of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, a lot to unpack.
It was just this massive change and so much innovation, but also so much turmoil and hardship. It's just a really complex story and one that's still relevant today.
Absolutely. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just a point in time. It was a fundamental shift in how humans interact with the world.
That's a good way to put it. And that shift, it's still going on.
It is, yeah. And, speaking of that shift, there's this one detail in the sources that I found really interesting. It mentions that, like, at first, machine-woven cloth, it just couldn't match the quality of hand-woven Indian cloth. What what do you think that tells us about technology, skill, and, like, the economy?
Yeah, it really is interesting when you think about it like that, how even centuries ago, something like the Industrial Revolution still has its fingerprints all over the world today.
Totally. I mean, I guess that's why we do this show, right?
Exactly.
It's like it wasn't just a blip on the radar. It changed everything.
Right. It wasn't just a moment in time. No, it was like this fundamental shift, like I was saying, in how we as humans connect with the world around us.
Yeah, and it's a shift that's still happening.
Absolutely.
And speaking of those connections, one thing that really stood out in the sources was, how industrialization affected the environment. Oh, right. Yeah. We were talking about all the pollution and the forests being cut down and all the resources getting used up. It's like progress has a dark side.
Yeah, and it all kind of goes back to like, our need for those fossil fuels like coal.
Exactly. And that brings up a really important question, like how can we make progress in a way that doesn't wreck the planet?
Yeah, that's a question we're still trying to figure out, right?
Definitely. But the Industrial Revolution, it's like a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
It shows us what can happen when we just go full steam ahead without thinking about the consequences.
Yeah. And those smoky factories from way back when, they're like a reminder, right? Like, we got to learn from the past.
We do. It's a tough challenge trying to balance economic growth with protecting the environment.
But it's a challenge we got to face.
Absolutely. I mean,
No
we
problem.
owe it to, future generations to get this right.
Right. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here. We've seen the amazing inventions, the struggles, the victories, and the sad parts too.
It's been a whirlwind, that's for sure.
Yeah. But one thing's for sure, this period had a huge impact on the world, on everything.
It really did. I mean, it shaped the way we make things, our economies, even our relationship with nature.
And it's still shaping us today.
Right. It's like its legacy lives on.
It does. It really does. And before we wrap things up, I wanted to circle back to something we talked about earlier.
Okay.
Remember how those early machine-made textiles, like they couldn't really compete with the quality of the hand-woven Indian cloth?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's a really interesting point. It kind of shows that, just because something is new and technologically advanced doesn't always mean it's better.
Right.
At least not right away.
Yeah.
Like sometimes those old ways of doing things, they have a quality that's hard to replicate.
Hmm.
It takes time, for technology to catch up.
It makes you think, like as technology keeps changing so fast, what's going to happen to those human skills, those crafts?
Yeah, that's a big question. And how do we make sure that everyone benefits from all this progress, not just a few lucky people?
Yeah. Big questions for sure. And I think they're questions worth thinking about, as we go about our lives in this crazy tech-filled world. So keep those questions in mind, as you explore the Industrial Revolution and just history in general.
It's a journey full of twists and turns, and there's always something new to learn.
That's why we love it. So thanks for joining us on the deep dive. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those big questions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. See you next time. Tell us what you think about this episode. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.